Bom dia a todos e a todas. Sou Francisco Ferreira, presidente da Zero, Associação, Sistema, Terrestre, Sustentável, Association for the Sustainability of the Earth System. É um enorme prazer dar-vos as boas-vindas neste evento organizado pela Zero com o apoio do projeto Climate of Change e congratular-me pelo vosso interesse numa conferência que quer dar destaque a uma visão distinta sobre o funcionamento da nossa economia. Neste evento serão debatidos caminhos para ir além do PIB e aferirmos o bem-estar de uma sociedade não apenas pela riqueza que produz, mas também pela felicidade, a saúde, a realização de quem nela vive, enquadrada pelos limites planetários. Contaremos com a presença de oradores com ampla experiência neste campo, aos quais agradecemos a generosidade de estarem aqui conosco e que partilharão o seu conhecimento e entusiasmo em relação a uma economia do bem-estar e metodologias semelhantes que possibilitem uma visão holística do desenvolvimento de uma sociedade. A Zero, a quando da sua fundação há aproximadamente 5 anos, sempre considerou que tinha sentido um olhar diferente, mais integrado e mais justo sobre a forma como devemos avaliar o nosso desenvolvimento, integrando as diferentes valências da sustentabilidade, reconhecendo que há uma relação direta entre o bem-estar e o grau de riqueza até um determinado nível de rendimento, mas que, a partir daí, são outros os valores responsáveis pela satisfação individual e coletiva. Depois da atual crise pandémica, não podemos ficar indiferentes. Temos urgência em discutir e, acima de tudo, em implementar soluções resilientes para motivar a sociedade a salvaguardar o planeta, recorrendo a novas métricas que contribuam como soluções para a crise climática, a crise de recursos, a crise de perda de biodiversidade, mas também para combater as diversas desigualdades sociais que impedem a prosperidade. Esta é uma conferência que marca o início de um processo que esperamos possa levar Portugal a aderir à abordagem da well-being economy, a economia do bem-estar, e é principalmente um ponto de partida e o início de um caminho que sabemos desafiante, mas pertinente. A sessão será gravada e posteriormente disponibilizada no canal da Zero no YouTube. Dou agora a palavra ao Sr. Ministro do Ambiente e Ação Climática, João Pedro Matos Fernandes, através de uma intervenção gravada, dada a impossibilidade de última hora de hoje aqui estar a participar connosco em direto. E aproveito desde já para lhe agradecer esta disponibilidade para participar nesta sessão de abertura.
Minhas senhoras e meus senhores, começo por agradecer o convite que me foi endereçado e dizer-vos que é uma honra poder participar neste debate sobre o caminho para uma economia de bem-estar. O último ano e meio tem sido particularmente desafiante e sombrio. O que começou por ser uma crise de saúde pública rapidamente se transformou numa crise económica e social e revelou fragilidades da nossa sociedade e do nosso modelo económico. Estes desafios vieram somar-se à já sentida urgência ambiental, às alterações climáticas e à perda da biodiversidade. Estes desequilíbrios estão na gênese de desigualdades, conflitos e crises. A pandemia que enfrentamos evidenciou a importância do equilíbrio homem-natureza, reforçando a importância de uma recuperação alicerçada nos princípios de sustentabilidade. Este é, por isso, o momento de reequacionar o nosso modelo económico e de questionar se a prosperidade se deve medir apenas através do PIB. Há muito que a sabedoria popular diz que o dinheiro não traz felicidade, mas é certo que este é o meio de elevar os padrões de vida. O problema é que não pode ser este o único indicador para definir prosperidade ou bem-estar. Temos de medir o que valorizamos em vez de valorizar o que medimos. Emergem atualmente novas narrativas que pretendem repensar as lógicas de crescimento económico e de progresso, desafiando as métricas tradicionais e partilhando a ambição de alcançar o desenvolvimento sustentável, designadamente desacoplando o crescimento económico da utilização dos recursos ou das emissões. Existe nos dias de hoje uma grande pressão para uma transição para um sistema mais sustentável, devido não só aos problemas ambientais que estão a colocar em risco o sistema de suporte da vida na Terra, mas também pela não satisfação das expectativas sociais, devido, por exemplo, às elevadas taxas de desemprego, onde elas existem, as condições de trabalho precárias, a vulnerabilidade social e os grandes desafios económicos, tais como o risco do fornecimento de matérias-primas, mercados desregulados, tudo isto são realidades com que hoje nos confrontamos. Os principais objetivos para enfrentar os desafios atuais e futuros da sustentabilidade na escala global enquadram-se os objetivos adotados pelas Nações Unidas na Agenda 2030 para o Desenvolvimento Sustentável, transformar o nosso mundo, onde os países aderentes manifestam uma clara intenção de criar uma conexão entre os três pilares de desenvolvimento sustentável, económico, social e ambiental, ao longo de 17 Objetivos de Desenvolvimento Sustentáveis, os ODS. A noção de que uma abordagem económica conservadora não permitirá obter os resultados a que nos propomos compele-nos a debater outras abordagens. Não podemos abordar os desafios do futuro com os instrumentos do passado. Aspectos sociais, ambientais, culturais, saúde, para além de outros indicadores económicos, têm que entrar nesta equação. Os vários exercícios que têm vindo a ser feitos demonstram-nos que aquilo que valorizamos nem sempre é o mesmo. Em parte, depende também do grau em que as necessidades básicas estão ou já foram supridas. Hoje, fruto dos eventos que têm vindo a ocorrer, certamente valorizamos mais a capacidade de resposta em saúde, a qualidade da nossa democracia e a segurança. O desejo de uma abordagem mais abrangente tem conduzido várias organizações em todo o mundo a promover exercícios que visam um cruzamento de diferentes indicadores para uma caracterização do desenvolvimento de uma sociedade que vão além do PIB. Seja o Better Life Index da OCDE, o Relatório do Desenvolvimento Humano da UNEP, a verdade é que esta é uma matéria de atualidade e que tem vindo a ser testada com resultados interessantes e que nos merecem a reflexão. Minhas caras e meus caros, Portugal assumiu o compromisso de alcançar a neutralidade carbónica até 2050. Este é hoje também o objetivo que a União Europeia coletivamente se propôs alcançar enquanto elemento central do Pacto Ecológico Europeu, a nova estratégia de desenvolvimento para a Europa. A inscrição em lei do objetivo de alcançar a neutralidade carbónica até 2050 e a ambição de emissões negativas após esta data é um marco histórico que define a linha de política para os próximos 30 anos, em harmonia com uma estratégia de desenvolvimento e tem que ser fundada em objetivos ambientais e sociais. Quando em 2016 o Governo assumiu este objetivo, foi com a convicção que seria transformador na forma como vemos a sociedade e a economia, que exigia passar de uma economia linear, dependente de combustíveis fósseis, para uma economia circular, regeneradora de recursos e baseada nos nossos recursos endógenos, todos eles renováveis. E é num quadro de maior desenvolvimento económico que este objetivo se torna mais alcançável, contrariando a convicção, há muito ultrapassada, que o ambiente e a economia são políticas antagónicas. O caminho para a neutralidade, para além de vários benefícios colaterais para a sociedade, exige investimentos da ordem de 1 bilhão de euros até 2050, sendo um fator dinamizador da nossa economia. Importa por isso que as vantagens do modelo que professamos possam ser capturadas através de modelos que olhem não apenas para o PIB, mas também para as múltiplas vantagens que a transição para uma sociedade neutra em carbono e resiliente ao clima incorpora. No momento em que, mais do que nunca, é fundamental unirmos esforços para uma recuperação económica e social inclusiva, alinhada com os objetivos climáticos e ambientais, o debate em torno do significado de bem-estar e prosperidade ganha espaço e merece reconhecimento. Agradeço mais uma vez o convite que me foi dirigido, desejo a todos um debate frutífero e, obviamente, um muito bom dia.
Vamos assim prosseguir com a mesa redonda sobre a economia do bem-estar, cuja moderação estará a cargo de Patrícia Heidegger, diretora de Políticas Globais e Sustentabilidade do European Environmental Bureau, a Federação Europeia das Organizações Não Governamentais do Ambiente, de que a ZER também é membro. Patrícia, the floor is yours.
Yes, hello, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the roundtable on the path towards a well-being economy. Indeed, I'm with the European Environmental Bureau. We're the largest federation of environmental citizens organizations in Europe, and I'm very happy to be moderating this exchange today. And I'd also like to thank our member Zero for putting together this very excellent program. So this thinking around well-being economies is not at all new, but we have witnessed in the last years a growing discourse around well-being economies that are oriented towards ensuring that healthy people can live on a healthy planet. And at the top level of policymaking for us here in Europe, the European Green Deal has now set the objective to create a carbon neutral economy that works for people. So if we look around us towards many other parts in the world, we can claim that we have set comparably high standards for environmental and social protection in Europe. But we all know that something is wrong. Even with all the sustainability measures taken so far, we are still exceeding, and we're increasingly exceeding the planet's ecological limits. We all know that if everyone lived like us Europeans, humankind would need around 2.8 planets to sustain itself. Western Europe imports more biomass, fuels, metals than it exports. So we're one of the most resource dependent regions in the world. For our food production, we depend on resources and other parts of the world. For our clothes, we depend on labor exploitations on the other side of the globe. So our economic system, we all know, is not just trashing our planet, but it's also not really able to deliver full social justice. 20% of Europeans live at risk of poverty today. And that's not even taking into account the aftermath of the pandemic. Every night, around 700,000 Europeans sleep on the street, and homelessness has seen an increase by 70% in just 10 years. And 1 out of 10 workers in Europe lives under the poverty line, even though these people have work. And that's because of extremely low wages, a number that has also seen a sharp increase over the last decade. So we're all aware of the fact that the pandemic has not just revealed that many of our health systems are underfunded, it has also exposed and deepened the existing inequalities in our societies and economies, whether that's the gap in unpaid care work provided by women to sustain our families and neighborhoods, or the unpaid care work provided to take care of the sick and the old, whether these are education systems that leave behind children from less affluent families, or whether that's the increased precarity of those who already suffered from weak social protection before the pandemic started. So I'm therefore very happy that we are discussing today with 3 distinguished experts who are all working from different angles for the creation of a well-being economy, where we use our limited resources to refocus on human and planetary well-being. GDP as the key indicator to measure not only the success of our economies, but even our whole societies has been questioned for a long time. However, nearly all of the world's economies and the governments behind them, even in the most developed nations, are still fixated on the idea that only an ever-growing, ever-expanding economy is good. So we're here today to discuss alternative approaches which can serve human and planetary well-being better, where we can thrive as individuals and as a community. So let me introduce our speakers. Carrie Exton leads the Wellbeing Data Insights and Policy Practice team in the OECD Center for Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability and Equal Opportunity, short WISE. The team helps to build the evidence base for wise policymaking, including the development of frameworks and indicators and their roles in supporting government decisions. Carrie is also the overall editor of How's Life, a series of reports which provides an in-depth assessment of WISE indicators across OECD and the partner countries. Her team is currently working on research projects, including the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on well-being, interlinkages between mental health and well-being and sustainability in Latin America and the Caribbean. Welcome, Carrie. Then we have Catherine Trebeck. Catherine is the founder and a strategic advocacy advisor of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and the co-founder of We All Scotland. She also holds various roles. She held various roles with Oxfam, Great Britain, and she instigated the Wellbeing Economy Government Partnership. Catherine is on several advisory groups dealing with well-being and sustainability. With a background in economics and a PhD in political science, she's also a visiting research fellow at the University of Strathclyde and a distinguished fellow at the Schumacher Institute. And she has published her last book in 2019, together with Jeremy Williams, called The Economics of Arrival: Ideas for a Grown-Up Economy. Welcome, Catherine. And we have with us Gary Gillespie. He was appointed Director and Scottish Government Chief Economic Advisor in 2011. He joined the civil service in 2000, coming from the University of Strathclyde, where his research interests included Scottish economy, regional economic modelling, and foreign direct investment. His current role is to provide economic advice to the First Minister and ministers, and it's one of the most visible roles in the public sector in Scotland. He publishes regular assessments of the state of the economy and analysis of key impacts and changes in the Scottish and UK economies. He's a regular participant in economic discussions across Scotland, the UK, and internationally. And he leads the engagement on the Wellbeing Economy Government Network, which was instigated in 2018. And he seeks to share best practices in delivering international change. Gary is also a honorary professor at Glasgow Caledonian University and a visiting professor at the University of Strathclyde. And he's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences since 2017. Welcome, Gary. So how are we going to organize the roundtable this morning? Francisco has already explained that we will first hear a presentation from our three guests. They will share some of their recent work around the path towards a well-being economy with us. And we will then go into questions and a discussion. You as participants, you are invited to put your questions in the Q&A box. I will try to pick as many of them as possible, maybe also summarizing some of them. And we will also invite some of the participants to ask their questions directly to the speakers. In order to do so, we will then enable you to unmute and switch on your videos. If you put questions in the Q&A, just make sure to keep them short and precise. And also let us know if you direct your question at one of the speakers in particular. So let's not wait longer. Let's start with the first presentation from Carrie Exton. Carrie, over to you.
Thanks very much, Patricia, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here with you this morning. Please bear with me for a second while I just share my screen. How is that working out? Can everyone see my screen? Perfect. Okay.
That looks good.
And I'll just minimize that. So thank you again for inviting me. It's a great panel to be part of this morning. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Catherine and Gary as well. I'm going to start us off this morning by talking about measurement. But I don't just want to stop at measurement. I want to talk about pathways between measurement and policy. I'm just waiting for my screen to advance. Grab. My slides are not moving forward.
sometimes, unfortunately, it doesn't work if you're in full screen mode.
Okay, I'll just exit out of full screen. Normally works perfectly for me, but it's very slow to pick up this morning. Here we go. Okay. Yes. Fingers crossed this works out. So, well-being is a really big topic, and it's something that the OECD has been working on now for well over a decade. So I thought what I'd do this morning is share some thoughts on the experiences we've had with measurement and how to translate those gradually into policy actions. There are three key messages from this presentation. The first is that for well-being to be a useful policy concept, we need to be able to measure it. But on their own, measurement dashboards will not change policy. Well-being is not a list of one-size-fits-all policy recommendations. Some of the real value lies in offering better ways of making policy decisions. Finally, we need to now focus on providing decision makers with concrete tools for integrating well-being evidence into day-to-day policy making. There are already some examples emerging, and there are others that can be adapted. So that, in a nutshell, is my presentation. But to give you a little bit more background, first of all, to start with the origins of this work, at its heart, defining well-being is about what makes for a good life. That's quite an ambitious and intimidating objective. And for many people, it's maybe a question that's best left for philosophers. Certainly not one that they want economists and statisticians anywhere near. But it's a question that we need to tackle because governments are implicitly answering that question every time they take decisions. It's a sad fact of life that public money always comes with trade-offs and opportunity costs. So measuring well-being is an important part of improving the policy dialogue to make those trade-offs more explicit. So Stiglitz and colleagues have already pointed out, what we measure affects what we do. If we measure the wrong things, we do the wrong thing. The OECD has itself, since 2011, defined its mission as supporting better policies for better lives. If we're serious about this, then we need an agreed way to define and measure this concept of better lives to know if our recommendations are having the right effects. So this slide shows the OECD framework for well-being. There's a long story behind how we developed this framework, and it's one I don't have time to go into this morning. But there are a few key features that I should point out. The first is that there are these two broad pillars. Current well-being on the one hand, so is life good here and now? And resources for future well-being on the other hand. So the key things that underpin well-being for the whole of society. So under current well-being, our measures are very outcomes focused. What we're trying to do here is capture the key ingredients for a good life. Some of these domains are relatively traditional and they focus on material conditions such as income and wealth, work and job quality, and housing. Beyond material conditions, we look at outcomes that play an essential role in quality of life. So things like health, knowledge and skills, environmental quality, subjective well-being, and safety. But there's also a relational component to well-being, which is reflected particularly in domains such as social connections and civic engagement, but also arguably work-life balance, because that's how you reconcile the different relationships in your life, both at work and at home. One crucial point to underscore in our framework is that measuring the distribution of these outcomes is core to our approach. So for all of our indicators, we include not just averages, but also inequalities. And we look at inequalities in a variety of ways. So we look at inequalities between groups, such as men and women, young and old, high and low educated groups. But we also look at the total dispersion So that's about the inequalities between people at the top and the bottom of the distribution. And finally, we look at deprivations, so people who are falling below a necessary threshold of well-being. Another important point to stress is that many of our indicators come from objective sources. So a common misunderstanding about well-being measurement is the only thing we care about is people's perceptions and experiences, and not the reality of their living conditions. So it's important to say up front that our well-being framework considers both of those things as important. You can't understand the quality of people's lives without taking their own views into account, but it's also really important to look at the objective indicators of living standards and living conditions. Under the second pillar, resources for future well-being, we're looking at the complex systems that sustain well-being over time. We do this in 4 broad groupings: natural, human, economic, and social capital. We use this word capital to imply a store of value that can deliver well-being over time, but it doesn't mean that we monetize all of these capitals. We don't just look at capital stocks in the classic sense of the stock only. We're also looking at flows into and out of those stocks, so investment and depletion of those stocks, as well as the risk and resilience factors that can affect their value over time. So there's not time today to go into great detail about how we translate this framework into a set of indicators. But for some practical examples, I would encourage you to take a look at our How's Life publication. It covers 38 OECD countries, of course, including Portugal, as well as 3 non-member countries, Brazil, Russian Federation, and South Africa. We've got over 80 different indicators of current well-being, inequalities, and sustainability. And in the most recent edition, we focus in particular on trends in well-being since 2010. To give you a very brief flavor of some of the headline indicators, this wheel shows how Portugal performs on selected elements of current well-being relative to other OECD countries. So shorter bars always mean lower well-being, worse performance. Longer bars always mean higher well-being, better performance. The first thing to observe is that there are some gaps in our data. So these white blocks show where data is missing on things like work-life balance, social connections, civic engagement, and also health inequalities. So these are areas where we do not have any data for Portugal. Second thing to notice is that, like every OECD country, Portugal has some comparative strengths in well-being, but also some areas well-being is more challenged. For example, Portugal has lower homicides than the OECD average, relatively low levels of housing overcrowding, and a relatively low share of the population exposed to dangerous levels of air pollution. But the shorter bars highlight some challenges for Portugal, including, for example, poor access to green space for urban populations, low voter turnout, low income and wealth, and comparatively low subjective well-being. There's also a comparatively large gender gap in feelings of safety. So we have a very wide dashboard covering each of the 4 capitals. And what you see on this screen is just a few brief highlights. The numbers in the bubbles here show the OECD comparison in tiers. So number 1 means that Portugal is in the best third of the OECD. Number 2 means it's in the middle third. And number 3 means it's among the worst third. So for example, here we see Portugal has greenhouse gas emissions and material footprints that are smaller than the OECD average. But for example, emissions over the last 10 years have been relatively stable in Portugal at a time when total OECD emissions have been falling by 4.3% over the same period. Portugal also has comparatively low levels of educational attainment among young adults, a high level of labour underutilisation, and a low level of trust in others, for example. So the OECD is definitely not alone in measuring these well-being indicators, and it's really not a new idea, as Patrizia said. It's important to highlight that many OECD governments are quite advanced in this task already. That's not to say that there isn't more work to do on measurement. There surely is. And a particular problem we've been feeling lately is the timeliness of these measures. If you don't have timely indicators, they are poor tools for guiding policy, particularly in a crisis. However, many countries have made a start, often with quite high-profile initiatives. And this slide shows these measurement dashboards come in different shapes and sizes. So the x-axis on this figure is actually the number of indicators covered in these different frameworks across OECD countries. The variation in framework size often reflects what the dashboard has been generated to do. So, for example, dashboards that are used for general monitoring of well-being, often in national statistical offices, tend to be very wide dashboards because you need to cast the net really wide if your goal is monitoring. On the other hand, some of the dashboards that have been developed with a more focused policy purpose, they're often a bit shorter because it's easier to communicate, but crucially, you really need to focus on your priorities. We've got a number of OECD countries that actually have two different dashboards. So they'll have a really comprehensive monitoring dashboard, often run by the statistical office, and then a shorter dashboard to focus really on the priorities, often within a government ministry. So this heat map shows the extent of agreement across a selection of well-being measurement approaches in OECD countries. The darker the shade here is the higher agreement at the level of the indicators. So for example, here we can see that health, education, and jobs are covered in almost every framework, and there's a high level of consensus around the indicators that countries use to measure these concepts. Conversely, if we look at something like civic engagement, housing, or work-life balance, they're covered in many dashboards, but not all of them, and there's a weaker level of agreement in terms of the exact indicators used across countries. So despite this progress in measurement, I'd say we're very much in the early stages of seeing OECD member countries applying these dashboards in a systematic way to inform policy decisions. And I suspect that Catherine and Gary will have a bit more to say about this. In my last few slides, I wanted to offer a few reflections on some of the potential benefits of a well-being economy, so putting people's well-being at the centre of public policy. And when we look across countries' motivations for developing their well-being dashboards, a few common themes emerge. For example, these dashboards are used to provide a more complete and balanced picture of societal progress and its sustainability. These dashboards are used to highlight inequalities across a range of outcomes and opportunities, showing the diversity of people's experiences. They're used to foster public debate and engagement, so to have a dialogue about what matters most to people. They're also used to support strategic alignment of goals across government, priority setting, and also accountability. Finally, there's a role for these dashboards in promoting better appraisal and evaluation of the impact of policy on people's lives, including more clearly identifying trade-offs and synergies so that they can be properly debated. In essence, many of these dashboards aim to anchor in policy discussions issues that would otherwise risk falling beyond the radar of policy debate. So really quickly, what are the mechanisms that countries are using? One area that countries have focused on in particular is informing the budget process. So we've seen across Europe a couple of different laws passed that require countries to monitor well-being indicators and potentially at varying different levels to integrate that monitoring into the dialogue around the budget process. This is perhaps most advanced in New Zealand, but very recently Canada also released their 2021 budget. And again, there's been a big effort to start integrating their new quality of life dashboard throughout that decision-making process. So looking at how do the items of expenditure proposed in the budget actually contribute towards people's well-being, which is something that the New Zealand 2019 well-being budget also did. New Zealand also looked upstream to actually use their well-being monitoring work to identify priorities for the budget. So there's both sort of going through the cycle of the budget, looking at priorities right the way through to assessing spending bids for their impact. Another area we've seen wellbeing indicators used is in national development plans and performance frameworks. I'll let Gary talk about Scotland, but we've also seen some parallels in Slovenia, in Paraguay, and in Finland. We've also seen the development of new institutional structures. So for example, within the United Kingdom, the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, which acts as a hub to collect evidence on what matters for wellbeing and feed that evidence into the decision-making process by policymakers. Wales has got a Future Generations Commissioner whose role it is to champion champion and challenge the government in its pursuit of well-being for future generations. All of that was put into legislation by the Future Generations Act in Wales. Finally, we've seen tools developed for civil servants to help them integrate wellbeing indicators into their daily work. And I think this is really important. If we're going to see a transformational change across government, we really need to target the daily activities of government. So, for example, the United Kingdom Treasury's Green Book on appraisal and evaluation in central government, or the New Zealand Treasury's Living Standards Framework and the budget guidance that they provide to agencies for assessing wellbeing impacts of budget bids. So one thing to stress here is that a wellbeing approach isn't necessarily about a prescribed list of policies or a one-size-fits-all approach. It's really about a tool for improving the quality of government decision-making. So to focus decision-making on the outcomes we want for our societies and to provide a common framework for understanding the roles and objectives of government across different departments. So this second point is particularly important because at the moment it's often the case that different departments understand the word well-being in different ways. So for an economics department, well-being is about maximising income and growth. For social policy departments, well-being might be about achieving social objectives. So without a common framework for understanding, these departments will continue making parallel assessments in their own silos. So education policy is assessed for its impact on education and maybe growth, but the wider societal or environmental impacts are not considered. So the real game changer then is about a wellbeing approach helping to foster more integrated assessments of policies. So that economic policies are assessed for their environmental and social impacts, and so that environmental policies are assessed for their economic and social impacts, etc. So having agreed a set of wellbeing indicators then gives departments a very practical understanding of what this concept of social impact or economic impact really means in practice. We could then ask, what about a wellbeing approach for the COVID-19 rebuild and recovery strategies that are currently being developed and debated? I guess a key point here would be to not see these different elements as separate objectives. So a green recovery, an inclusive recovery, a resilient recovery, these are not separate things. They need to be delivered by the government as a whole, working together jointly. So this in turn requires us to make assessments about the quality of growth, not just the quantity of growth, and the quality, for example, of the digital transformation, not just the quantity of the transformation. I will end it there because I'm sure there is still a bit of time for debate and discussion, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carrie, for this excellent and very clear presentation about how we can measure well-being, also, the different approaches to doing so, and also why it's so important for governments what they can actually do once they have these indicators in place. And yeah, I think we often forget that indicators sound very technical, and we just think of statistics. But you quoted Stiglitz saying, yeah, if we measure the wrong things, we'll come up with the wrong solutions, or the other way around. If we don't have the right information, we can't come up with the right policy. So I think that presentation was a very excellent explanation of how we can measure well-being and what governments can then do with that information. I have one follow-up question for you before we move to the next presentation. So we're discussing today, I mean, how we can move beyond GDP as kind of the key indicator of, you know, how strong and good our economy and even our society is. Well, we see all these indicators of well-being developed and used next to GDP. So it seems that for many governments, GDP remains kind of the lead indicator, or the, you know, the headline indicator for many governments across the OECD and elsewhere in the world. But in particular, in kind of the context of highly developed or highly industrialized countries, you know, any kind of continued GDP growth usually comes with a growth of environmental impacts and a growth in resource use and raw material use. And many OECD members, well, manage to bring down their emissions, but not sufficiently. And especially, we don't manage to bring down resource use sufficiently. So what is the discussion within the OECD in terms of really moving beyond GDP, kind of replacing GDP by other indicators, not using well-being indicators next to it? Or does the OECD still encourage the overall growth of GDP in highly industrialized countries? Can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure, happy to. So I guess the first thing to say is that GDP and the national accounts from which GDP has been derived are essential tools for economists. If you want to effectively regulate the economy, you need to know what's happening inside it. Being a useful tool doesn't necessarily mean that GDP is a good goal for society. And as you know, that's why we've developed well-being indicators. Taking a step back, it's perhaps helpful to unpack why it is as a society we are so attached to the concept of GDP. And I think for many people, it's seen as a signal about jobs and livelihoods, for example, which really matter to people. It's seen as a signal about what might happen to your pension fund, which is part of your economic security, something people really care about. It's seen as a signal of likely government revenues, which, you know, among other things, help to support the youngest and most vulnerable in our society. And government spending is also going to be an essential part of how we make the green transition happen and how we protect biodiversity. So that government spending is important. Our work on well-being is about saying, let's put these things that people value at the center, and then ask what kind of economy and what kind of GDP growth and what kind of society we need to reach those aims. So taking a very personal perspective from where I sit, I'm not honestly sure that it's helpful to put GDP and well-being in opposition to one another. It creates conflicts and sort of warring camps that could speak past each other rather than working together. And, you know, I think with the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, we are facing a clear and present danger where cooperation and collaboration is the only way to solve these. And my fear is that if we make well-being all about demonizing GDP, we instantly lose a large chunk of the people that we so urgently need to persuade to change the way that they're working. So I would focus on making the conversation really constructive and inclusive rather than destructive and divisive. I think my final thought on this in terms of the reconciliation process is to really focus on the win-wins, which is what a well-being economy is about. So focus on the areas of economic activity that are good for sustainability and good for jobs, good for people. focus on the areas of government investment that offer both a strong return on well-being, but also a good fiscal run in the future. So things like investing in mental health, which both supports people today, but also enables their participation in education and in work, that reduces the amount of spending the government has to do further down the line when people really get into trouble. So I would say, let's focus on the win-wins. Let's focus on the areas of economic activity that can really benefit people and the planet.
Thanks a lot, Carrie, for that great answer. Let's move to our next speaker. Let's move to Catherine. Catherine Trebeck from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you ever so much, Patricia, and thank you particularly to Zero and to the European Environment Agency for making today happen. It's really fantastic conversation that's being sparked here, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and particularly delighted to be joining my colleagues and friends, Carrie and Gary, on today's panel. It's a real delight to be joining them again, even sadly just virtually. So I want to pick up a little bit where that final question was heading, in terms of looking at why we need to really think very thoughtfully and concertedly about the nature of the economic system and what sort of outcomes it's delivering for people and planet. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves that pre-COVID, we had an economy that was designed for and dependent on economic growth, and so often measured by gross domestic product. But particularly as Francisco outlined in his introductory remarks to today, there is so much evidence why that economic system, even prior to COVID, wasn't cutting the mustard. It wasn't delivering enough benefits for enough people, and it was putting more and more pressure on the planet in such a profoundly dangerous way that we need to fundamentally rethink the economic recipes that we're reaching for as we emerge from the coronavirus crisis. And we had an economy going into COVID that has been growing to various degrees for decades, and yet we saw that so much of that growth, and that's only been exacerbated in the last 12 months or so, has been captured by those at the very top. So we see these inequalities layered on with horizontal inequalities between different groups, particularly around race and gender and so on. But we also see, as Patricia was alluding to, those environmental impacts, and we see the alarm bells being rung by scientists and by young people, getting louder and louder. And Portugal, like my own country, Australia, has been ravaged by wildfires, which are just, to me, one of the most starkest expressions of what happens when we collectively put too much pressure on Mother Nature. But of course, who's putting that pressure on Mother Nature? There's huge inequalities in that, but perhaps we can come back to in the discussion later. But I think the reality also, in terms of the benefits apparently of economic growth, is that if you look globally, there are what economists would describe as diminishing marginal returns. So at early stages of economic development, when growth is used well, when it's directed to those collective institutions such as our healthcare systems, our education systems, when it's pro-poor, so when it goes to those people who need it most, whether that's a country or within a country. There are certainly parts of my country here in Scotland where I'm living today that do need more growth. But it's about taking a much more sophisticated look at what sort of growth and where it's needed. And what's happened is that you can see that certain stages that economic growth does deliver benefits, but those benefits start to tail off, and we enter this term of diminishing marginal returns, where the benefits for more growth start to decrease. There's also a challenge of confusing means and ends in conversations around economic growth. And here you just have to turn on your news radio in the morning to hear politicians and the mainstream media talking about recovery, and how that's measured so often is just through GDP terms. And the assumption is that that will necessarily translate to the sort of benefits that people on planet really need: secure livelihoods, quality of life, a good quality local environment. And yet there's so much evidence from the past that we cannot make those assumptions because that read across is failing. There's also a challenge in terms of the measure of GDP itself. And to me, this is quite a big, substantial one, that it doesn't reward us as societies when we get things right. And perhaps even worse in that, it's got bound up in it a whole lot of perverse incentives. So if people are kept safe, if they're kept healthy in their communities, then GDP largely won't be affected. But if people are crashing their cars, if they're so stressed because of precarious work that they need to go to hospital or have prescription medicines, or if divorce rates are going up and so on, then those sorts of responses to that damage to communities will show up as increases in GDP. And the Canadian economist Mark Anelski reminds us that in GDP terms, the hero is a chain-smoking terminal cancer patient who's going through an expensive divorce, who crashes his car on the way to his job as an arms dealer because he's texting while eating a takeaway hamburger. And so when I talk about perverse incentives that are bound up in GDP, that is what I mean. It doesn't disentangle in the sophisticated way that the OECD's wellbeing framework does what it is we really need. And so the time has come is to certainly look beyond GDP and think about what is it that we really need to align our economies and our measures with, and how can we concertedly reconstruct our economy around that? Because part of the problem is that with this economy that has been orientated towards economic growth, perhaps more explicitly than the growth measure itself, GDP, was ever designed to do, is the response has been largely patching up. It's largely been remedial activity. It's been redistribution after the fact, rather than asking, why did we allow the gap between rich and poorest to open up so much in the first place? It's been topping up people's wages. And Patrizia, you talked about the huge amount of work inequality, in work poverty in Europe. I think 1 in 10 was the figure you gave. And so often you see governments stepping in to top up people's wages or provide housing subsidies, and all of that is reactive spending driven by the failure of the economic system to get things right in the first place. And in environmental terms, our ecological economists will talk about defensive expenditure. And you only have to look at the amount of spending to build, to repair, and the insurance payouts after wildfires or after oil spills. I mean, even just this pressure that's very popular at the moment to plant more trees to suck carbon out of the atmosphere, and other methods of carbon capture, sequestration, and storage is a response to the extent to which our economies have pumped carbon into the atmosphere. It's a sign of our collective failure to get things right first time round. And so the project of so often of politicians and of charities has been that after the fact. And in Australia, we describe them as band-aids, these things. In the UK, I've been trained to describe them as sticking plasters, but that's the territory that social policy has largely operated in, these sort of sticking plasters on an inhumane economic system. So that is the enormity of the challenge that we face today. And how can we reorientate our economy so that it can ask more of the economy than just relying on that after the fact, remedial, downstream, end of pipeline, failure orientated spending. This is about thinking bigger. It's about thinking upstream. It's about asking, why are we having to undertake so much of this activity? It's daring to ask, can we do better than simply humanizing an economic system that has driven so much inequality, so much fracturing of communities, and so much damage to the environment? And transforming that economy is the project of what the Wellbeing Economy agenda. It is unapologetically about system change, and it's about creating an economy that delivers social justice on a healthy planet. That's the simplest way we can describe what a wellbeing economy is about. And at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, we've crowdsourced from our members what their visions for the economy is about, and we've distilled them down into what we describe as the 5 we all needs. These are the needs that we need to orientate our economy to deliver. And I suspect they'll be quite intuitive to you. These are things like connection, participation, dignity, fairness, and regenerating nature, and recognizing that our economies and societies are subsets of the natural world. And getting there is not a simple flick of a light switch, and Carrie's really outlined all those complicated and sophisticated programs and frameworks and dashboards that governments are embarking on and experimenting with to try to grapple with the suite of challenges and understand and disentangle some of the trade-offs that are apparent in moving in this direction. But I think at one level we need to remind ourselves this is about changing the purpose of the economy, changing the measures. Absolutely, bringing to the fore alongside GDP, because I completely agree with Carrie that it still has its benefits, but bringing to the fore other measures so we have a wider, richer sense of what it is our economy needs to be delivering. But it's also about not being ever faithful followers of economic growth, but being fair weather friends of growth. So asking, what sort of growth do we need, of what, in what circumstances, perhaps seeing it as more as a strategy than a goal in and of itself. It also requires fundamental change to how we do businesses, perhaps businesses also using profit making as a vehicle rather than a goal in and of itself. And there is a whole plethora of emerging different business forms that show us what this is like, from worker cooperatives to social enterprises to economy for the common good businesses and so on. Businesses saying we want to be commercially viable, but we want to do so in order to deliver social and environmental returns. And it's also about rethinking work, and Carrie showed how work-life balance is an important component of the wellbeing economy agenda in the OECD's framework. And this is very much about thinking, does work pay enough for people to live on? Does it provide people enough hours? Or does it perhaps demand too many hours of them so they can't undertake other activities in their community? And it's also about rethinking work, making sure it delivers meaning and purpose and autonomy. It's about rethinking how we design our cities, ensuring that economies are generated from the local up through the community wealth building agenda that I suspect Gary might talk to you a little bit about in terms of what's being done in Scotland. It's about redesigning our infrastructure. So it's not all about people driving to massive shopping centres and consumer citizens, but designing cities for bike lanes and for outdoor space and for communities to come together as just community members rather than just as consumers. And it's also about democracy. How are decisions taken? How participatory are they? How participatory is the spending of the money? And so some of the trends in wellbeing budgeting are really thinking about how can citizens be much more involved in the budget making process. And the good news is that so much of this is happening around the world already. We see this in pioneering governments that Carrie set out, and Gary's going to explain to you some of the exciting stuff that's happening in Scotland. We see it in businesses that are designing the way they operate to be part of the collective good. We see it in cities redesigning. And if I had more time, I would share with you some of my favorite examples of activities that show that this different way of doing things is not just preferable, but it's imminently possible. The challenge is that so much of that work is not sufficiently joined up. And so it means that people can feel isolated in their efforts, they feel disconnected from the wider changes, and often they're the exception that proves the rule. They're facing those dominant headwinds of a policy regime that isn't sufficiently supportive and encouraging of the sort of activities we need businesses, communities, city designers to take. And so that's why the Wellbeing Economy Alliance was created. it very much is about trying to connect that diversity of activity, and there'll be people within our membership and within the wider movement who probably disagree about some of the details or who have different emphasis of what needs to change. But that's okay, because so much change is necessary. And the key thing is to bring them all together in this collaborative space where we recognize we're part of a connected movement that's about reorientating the economy. And that also speaks to why the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership was created. This is about governments recognizing that in the 21st century, development is about delivering collective well-being for people and planet, but also that none of those governments have all the answers. And so they're coming together, as I suspect Gary will talk you through, these ideas of policy labs where they share what they're doing and reflect on some of the challenges. And rather than compete against each other in so often the way you see in international relations and international politics, these are governments led by Scotland, with New Zealand, Iceland, Wales and Finland, and a few other governments joining as well. These are governments who want to link arms in embarking on creating an economic system that is fit for the 21st century. And I'll stop there. Thanks so much, Patricia.
Thanks so much, Catherine, for for illustrating so well what a well-being economy is all about. I think that became very clear. We've also shared the link to the Wellbeing Economy Alliance in the chat for those of you who want to follow up. I have one more question for you, Catherine. So, we know now about the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and we know that part of that work was also to kind of bring together governments in that well-being focused government alliance. And you mentioned the countries that joined at the beginning, and then the other ones that joined later on. So what do you think? I mean, what was the motivation for these governments to come together around that well-being concept? Is it due to research? Is it due to, data from these indicators? Is it due to public pressure? What do you think motivates them? And what are also the benefits for those governments joining the Wellbeing Alliance?
Thanks. Gary will have thoughts on this too, because he, of course, sits within government and sees the understanding, the motivations internally. But from what I can gather from having worked with many of these governments, and particularly around the generation and the creation of WeGo, is that there's a diversity of motivations. Some of them, there's been very, very strong political leadership. And I think we see that in New Zealand, where the Prime Minister and also her Finance Minister, so Jacinda Ardern and Grant Robertson, have really been pushing, leaning on that decades worth of work that the New Zealand Treasury has been doing, working with the OECD around the living standards framework. And so it's really strong leadership there that has brought the space in the New Zealand government to lean into some of these questions. In Scotland, it's been a bit of both. There has been really strong political leadership, but also there's been a really rich conversation amongst businesses, amongst unions, amongst civil society in Scotland for decades, actually, really questioning what sort of economy do we need in Scotland. Scotland's really blighted by massive health inequalities that I think have really put on the table and in the public discourse in Scotland, the conversation around how the economy operates and is it meeting social justice concerns. In other countries, there'll be different motivations as well. I know, for example, in Finland, I've been working with some of our partner organisations there who've been agitating from the outside, but also working with some colleagues within the Finnish government to bring Finland into the conversation there too. So it's a diversity. And I think part of the benefit for these governments is that they get to share with colleagues that are grappling with similar questions and learn from each other, because each of these governments have different initiatives. They are leading and walking forwards on this conversation about creating a wellbeing economy in different ways. So Scotland, for example, has for a long time had the Scottish National Performance Framework. You heard Carrie talk about Wales with its Future Generations Commissioner. We've got Iceland with its really famous and very well regarded work on gender equality. In New Zealand, you've got the New Zealand budget. These are all different ways of grappling with some of these complicated questions. And so if these governments can go on a journey of continuous improvement, what we're going to see is much faster take up and translation of those ideas into other contexts. And I think that idea of that change can happen faster when these governments collaborate. There's also that lovely phrase that you have to learn from others' mistakes because you don't have enough time to make them yourself. And so I think these governments are also sharing this. We struggled with this and it didn't work. And I think it's quite a precious place given the way some of global politics has been going over the last few years.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So indeed, let's now hear from Gary, who is speaking on behalf of one of those governments who are doing that work, who are leading that work in Scotland. So Gary, over to you. Very keen to hear from your experience.
Okay, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to join the panel and follow Carrie and Catherine, who I've worked with now for a number of years. And we've both shared, I think, a similar journey along this path. So it's great to be part of this panel discussion. So what I'm going to maybe just talk about over the kind of 10, 15 minutes I have is to say something about some of the background in terms of the journey in Scotland towards this type of approach, what we mean by wellbeing economy, and maybe touch on some of the debates around how growth fits in that. And I'll finish a little bit about what we actually do within the wellbeing economy governments as well. Unusually, I don't usually have slides, but when I seen Carrie and Catherine were presenting, I thought I better have slides because they always have slides. So I was surprised to see Catherine without slides. So I have a slide set, which probably given my the speed that I speak at, so I'll try and slow down for the translator. It's probably better to use the slides. So can I have the first slide loaded up, please? Thank you very much. That's great. So let me start with a little bit on the wellbeing economy for Scotland. Just on this cover slide, you'll see on the left-hand side, progress, collaborate and address. If you like, that's the strap lines for the wellbeing economy government, progress towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals and national objectives, as Carrie says, reflected in the different performance frameworks that we have. Collaboration both to share policy experience and innovative policy, and also to address the economic, social, environmental challenges of our time, which is really what we'll talk about now in this session. So if you can move on to the next slide, thank you. So in this, I want to give you just a little bit of background towards Scotland. So we've had the same government in power now since 2007. And the approach to the economy has evolved over that time. The most recent economic strategy was published in 2015, and it recognised it took the work from the OECD and others around the issues to do with inequality within the economy, what was happening in terms of inequality, and even within advanced economies, how that was having negative impacts on the resilience of systems, on people, on planet. So a really strong focus on both having a competitive economy, but alongside that, tackling the deep-rooted and structural inequalities that were becoming more prevalent. To do that, we moved on to look at what would be a different type of growth, looking at an inclusive growth. Now, what we did here was essentially create a diagnostic tool. So it was starting to look at what matters to people, to think about how you would deliver this type of agenda. And we developed what was called an inclusive growth diagnostic, which we used very much in a place-based setting across Scotland. So we don't have the answer, but you could have look across economic, social and environmental domains, and to help policymakers think about how we join up these systems. The third area is obviously the national performance framework. Again, I'll come back to that during this. It's worth saying that the Scottish Government introduced the national performance framework in 2007, and we've had a long experience of trying to change how we think about society and how government operates. And finally, I think where we're arriving at now is this broader integration of economic, social and environmental objectives into what a well-being economy is, looking at living standards, outcome-based budgeting and international collaboration. But let me show you some of the slides now. If we go on to the next one, please. So Carrie in her remarks talked about the number of governments that now use performance frameworks or tools to go beyond GDP, to capture what matters to them and measure different systems. So this is the diagram from Scotland's National Performance Framework. It was updated in 2018 after a period of consultation in Scotland. And what's interesting about this is it's like all performance frameworks in one sense that it covers a range of domains across education, health, economy, social, justice, environment. So the 11 outcomes reflect what you would expect to see in that regard. At the centre of it is the government's purpose, which you can see, if you can read that, is about essentially enhancing the well-being of the citizens of Scotland. But interestingly, for the first time in this updated version, we have our values. And the values came about through consultation with the public and civic society. And it's really tries to get at what type of society you want to be. So within the values, kindness, dignity and compassion are part of that. And from a government's perspective, you can think about how do we treat people that interact with us? Do we provide services with that level of compassion, dignity or kindness? So quite an interesting development, and that came from what mattered to people and their interaction with government. The quote that's on the slide also comes from the launch of it, when the First Minister was talking about the relationship really with growth. And I've highlighted that, and I'll come back to that in the next one. So if you move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I think we've already touched on this a little bit about well-being economy. What does it mean, and how does it interact with growth, GDP? So what I've done here is I've put some selective quotes from different publications and work relating to how do you define a well-being economy. For me, it's quite simply, it's about maximising environmental, social and economic well-being. And economic well-being is there because that, as Carrie said, is often a driver. It can often be a positive driver of other well-being in creating wealth, opportunity, jobs and investment. But it's not a means to an end. It's not at the cost or degradation of the environment or at the expense of rising inequality. So you can see there's still quite a debate around how growth sits within this framework. The top left quote is from the work that was done, I think, by the OECD for the economy of well-being during the Finland presidency of the EU. The top right is a quote from the Scottish Government from our publications last year. And actually, I think the "we all" quote at the bottom actually picks up on a point from a publication that came out from an advisory group in Scotland last year as well, that was advocating strong growth. And I think the bottom right one is from the New Approaches to Economic Challenges, a series within the OECD. And it was from academics that came together to talk about the form of economic growth. So it's not the rate, it's the direction, the quality, and who's benefiting from it. So I think this is quite an interesting development and discussion, and it's still live. I think for me, the growth debate really reflects three dimensions, I think. So I suppose we know the limitations of GDP, what it measures and what it doesn't capture. I always think of GDP just simply as the value of the production of goods and services within an economy. So there's a value in understanding that, but there's also a value in recognizing what it doesn't measure as well. Obviously, it doesn't capture the environmental side, and also it doesn't capture the equity type arguments or the inequalities which Catherine has also raised. If you go on to the next one, please. Thank you. So this is a graphic actually from the work that was done, as I mentioned, during the Finland presidency of the EU, the economy of well-being. And again, it tries to kind of look at this trade-off between well-being and growth, and essentially change the dynamics of what we're trying to do in terms of changing the system rather than grow first and redistribute later. And Finland are obviously part of the Wellbeing Economy government and really come at this from a much stronger people well-being and probably health and social care perspective maybe than some of the other countries. Let me continue. If you go to the next one, I'll talk a little bit about how the well-being narrative and why we think the well-being narrative is important. So Carrie and Catherine talked about the different narratives around well-being economy, performance frameworks, framing, why it's needed, why it's really important, and both of them described it really well. I think for me, COVID-19, as the first speaker was talking about as well, the pandemic has really influenced or shone a light on the resilience of services, communities, and parts of the economy. And if anything, has reinforced the need to have a much more integrated well-being type approach, one that can look at social through the health lens, environmental through the resilience of our systems, and essentially through the lens of the economy and what opportunities that provides. So for me, if anything, COVID-19 and the response to COVID has reinforced this need to have a broader approach to the economy in that regard. If you go to the next slide, please. Thanks again. So this was some work that we did during maybe April, May last year. And in fact, June, I think we did, when we were taking part in one of the Wellbeing Economy Policy Labs that Catherine mentioned. And essentially, we were trying to assess the impact of COVID-19 on current wellbeing, what the wellbeing priorities would be for current and future generations, and what that would mean for the 4 capital type approach, which Carrie outlined as part of the Better Lives framework. So it's a kind of framing point. It's an opportunity to look at how things interact. And it's worth saying that I think because we always looked at national performance systems and thinking about systems, during COVID, our response to COVID was coordinated through a group called the 4 Harms Group, which recognised, firstly, dealing with the pandemic, the health risk to individual lives, the health impacts to wider systems, so the impact on wider health treatment, the social impacts of COVID-19 and restrictions, whether that was mental health, loss of education, housing, and the economic impacts through the loss of income, earnings, and jobs at risk. And we had this, what was termed the 4 Harms Group, which essentially fed in and provided advice to ministers for each response to COVID. And part of that came out of this kind of joined up thinking approach to government. And I was part of that work and represented the economic harm, if you put it that way. If you go to the next slide, please. So I suppose, I think partly from Carrie, I think there's a kind of challenge is, how do you move beyond metrics? So we all recognise that actually what you measure matters. Dashboards are great. You can have a look. Dashboards sometimes can be a little, as Carrie said, slightly out of date. So what really matters is the influence dashboards or data or analysis or evidence has in driving policy. So this is just an example from our programme for government from September 2020. And you'll see the three main themes that came out of that document on the right-hand side. National mission to create new jobs, good jobs and green jobs. This reflected at the time the view that the risk to jobs from the pandemic and what was happening in particular sectors. Promoting lifelong health and well-being. Again, Catherine mentioned the inequality challenges we've got around health and outcomes in Scotland, and how resilient people were to the pandemic. So that really strong focus on that, including mental health. And then essentially looking at the impact of COVID on our national performance framework. We published a report last year as well, looking at the impact of COVID on the living outcomes, and it really shone a light on the impacts on those structural inequalities. So the impacts on people furthest from the labour market, younger people, etc. So that's, I think that maybe touches to the point Carrie mentioned about how you go from kind of pandemic to policy. Let me just come on to a final section. I'll say a little bit about WeGo, and then we can, I'm sure there'll be loads of further follow-up conversations in the discussion. Okay, so I mentioned just at the outset, it's about progress, collaboration, and addressing the economic, social, and environmental challenges of our time. And what I'll do is I'll just give a little background to how it came about, how we participate at the moment, and how we think it will help this agenda going forward. So I think I've got 3 slides more and a couple of nice pictures. So this is a little bit of a timeline for the group. If you look at the picture on the bottom left-hand side, this is at the University of Glasgow, actually at an Inclusive Growth Conference in 2017. And I think you maybe can't pick out Catherine, but she's on the steps there as well. And that's beside the statue of Adam Smith. And the background to that was we'd been engaging with Catherine and others around this notion of a well-being economy, probably through most of 2016 and into 2017. And at the Inclusive Growth Conference, we had a morning session and invited other countries to come and talk about inclusive growth, but this was a separate session on a broader framing for well-being. And we were joined with political leadership from Sweden and Slovenia, and we had officials from Austria, Costa Rica, New Zealand, and other countries. The middle picture is at the OECD conference in 2018, and we formally launched the Wellbeing Economy Governments with Iceland, New Zealand and Scotland. Catherine was at that launch as well. And sorry, Catherine, this picture doesn't have you in it. I'm joined by Benedict, who's my counterpart in the Icelandic government, and Professor Joe Stiglitz at the launch. And the other picture is one of the engagements we had actually in Paris at an event. That's Martin Durand, formerly of the OECD, and where we had a participation from New Zealand, Iceland, and officials from France. So so that's probably some of the background. If we go to the next one, so thanks very much. So as Catherine mentioned, one of the mechanisms for how we can work collaboratively together is through this notion of policy labs. So when we started discussing and sharing, we thought there was a real opportunity, as Catherine and others have said, to share both innovative policies, to share common concerns or issues, and to share practice, both open and candid across governments, around how best to resolve those. So we started with our first policy lab in 2019 in the May, and that focused on performance frameworks, wellbeing, budgeting, and inclusive growth. And actually we had Carrie came along and presented at the opening of the conference alongside Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister of Scotland, and Katrine Jacobsdottir, the Prime Minister of Iceland. And Carrie set out the broader context of performance frameworks. We then, at those policy labs, looked at sustainable tourism and natural capital, and child poverty and predictive analytics. And essentially, the reason for those discussions, those topics were, at the time, those were topics that were of particular interest to the countries involved in the labs. It seems strange now, but in 2019, we were having real difficulties with overconsumption of tourism in terms of congestion and impacts on precious sites. We were looking at natural capital and the measurement of biodiversity loss and what was happening in places. And Scotland also at that time had legislated for child poverty targets to reduce child poverty, and both other countries were interested in looking at that. Since then, and obviously through COVID, we've continued with policy labs, and we've really used the COVID-19 to think about how that's impacted on our well-being and the resilience of our systems and how we've responded. So just last Thursday, we had a policy lab looking at net zero transition and the wellbeing economy. And it was led by Scotland and Iceland. And we talked about the experience of the just transition in Scotland, which essentially was set up as an independent group to look at how we make the journey of the transition to net zero by 2045, and how we do that in a way that doesn't reinforce the structural inequalities that are within the economy and join up the different systems. Incidentally, they have one of their main recommendations, which the government accepted fully, was to go beyond GDP and look at how you can use economic, social, and environmental indicators to really understand what's happening and drive change. We also had Catherine actually came along and spoke at a seminar to WeGo countries as well, which was great, and she gave an overview of her views and where there's opportunities and where things are moving. So at the moment, we have 5 countries involved in wellbeing economy governance. We have Finland and Wales joined during 2020. And as Catherine mentioned, we also have participation from other countries. Canada has been involved over the last year, participating in the policy labs and discussion. So that's very much a broad flavour of that. I think, let me just move to the final slide. And so this, I think I've included this slide because I think with our just transition, they argue that there's a political, moral and legal imperative to do the transition to net zero in a way that has these principles. This is a TED talk from Nicola Sturgeon, our First Minister, from July 2019, and she kind of sets out over 9 minutes why governments should prioritise well-being. And you'll see it touches on some of the material that Carrie mentioned about what you measure matters, limitations of GDP, and how as a political imperative it's crucial for governments to consider. So really, I think I would recommend that as an overview and summary of that work. And it also the First Minister also talks about the creation of the wellbeing economy governments. So I think, let me just finish now and say some final thoughts. I think we're talking about economic system change, then really you're talking about system change. You're talking about transformational rather than incremental, and that's all often difficult. And what you tend to find in systems is things can continue for a long time and then tip really quickly. So you suddenly get a consensus view that now's the time to deal with environment, now's the time to change a system. And I suppose one reflection from COVID-19 and the pandemic is that led to change, that led to a pace of change in how we live and work that we probably couldn't have envisaged happening before. So that tells you that people under circumstances can respond to change. I think the point about broader frameworks of success and measurement are required. You've got to build a coalition of the willing, of people that can do it. And ultimately, you can, I think there's a big role for the business sector and economy in this agenda as well. We need to make sure that they see it as being within their particular interests and that they are part of the change process. So anyway, I will stop there and allow you to go into questions, but thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Gary, for sharing all that insight into the work of the Scottish Government around well-being. I have one follow-up question for you, and then we indeed have a lot of interesting questions already in the Q&A and in the chat, and I'm already taking note of these, so we'll get to your questions. Gary, you've quoted from the OECD's Beyond Growth report, saying that countries ought to pay attention to the form of economic growth which a country experiences and which it aims to achieve, and it's not enough for GDP to be being on the rise if the underlying patterns generate harm. So it's the type of economic activity which matters. So now, if we look at the different sectors of the economy, I mean, obviously every single business wants to grow. That's in kind of the DNA of a conventional business model, that you want to grow. You want to sell more of your product or your service every single year. So what can governments do to define which parts of the economy, which types of economic activity can still grow to reach our objectives of a well-being economy? How can a government set a framework for the kind of activities, economic activities, that we want as part of a well-being economy?
Okay, no, thanks very much. And I suppose in a sense, if you think about the next 10 years and the transitions that are impacting the economy at the minute, from recovering from pandemic, from moving to net zero, from demographics, from the challenges around inequality and the legacies of the financial crisis, there's a lot of multiple impacts at the moment on the economy. But what's really the legal imperative to move to net zero? So we have targets by 2030. We're looking at a new 10-year economic plan for the economy. And essentially we have legal commitments that will bound, if you like, the system around our environment, our imperatives around social progress, whether that's child poverty targets or housing or wider. So in one sense, you've got a system that is going to pull you towards meeting these objectives. So in order to achieve those, you're going to have to transform sectors of the economy. We, as Catherine mentioned, we are an energy-rich country, both renewables and carbon. We have a an oil production sector as well, which essentially is now on a transition to renewable energy. So that will change that sector of the economy and industry. I think also what you'll see is if you take the net zero transition and what that will require, it will change how we use land, agriculture, farming, progress. It will change how we heat our homes. So there'll be a massive change in moving from carbon to renewables, and it will change obviously how we move about in transport. So I think all of that, in a sense, will create a process and dynamic of change, which will automatically reallocate resources across sectors of the economy, because investment will create jobs, and as essentially as markets change and global markets invest in renewable, sustainable types of progress, you will see that. You'll see that switch. So I think it's really important to have that kind of overarching principle and framing, and that will drive investment and business choices around that, alongside the government's role in ensuring that how we invest. Carrie talked about kind of win-wins. How we invest is reflected in that as well. So I think at the micro level, you can say, is there too much growth or not enough growth? But actually there will be growth in particular sectors of the economy, whether it's life sciences, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's storage capacity, technology. So that I think, in a sense, the economy always evolves, and that we're moving into a new system. COVID and the pandemic has also given us opportunities to think about how we live and work as well. And we're looking at, for example, 20-minute neighbourhoods. We'll probably have a blended model of working from home and in the office going forward. We've seen obviously a massive change in transport usage over the last year. We're seeing an increasing trend in people using active transport, both walking and cycling. So again, it's getting back to my kind of final point, often systems change things quicker than you could imagine. When you set targets, it takes you time to build that kind of knowledge and coalition, and ultimately systems along with incentives will drive that. So the economy is central to that transformation, including business and people, and it's for us really to make sure that they feel part of it and not essentially out with that progress.
Thanks a lot, Gary. Well, let's come back to all our other speakers as well, to Catherine and Carrie. I'd like to start with one question from Ivo Gomez Francesco, which links quite well to what Gary was just talking about. I mean, the role of the different sectors of the economy. So Ivo had a question around, well, how can we establish a well-being economy if we kind of close our eyes to the social and environmental impact of companies and of multinationals. So I would like to ask the question to Carrie. I mean, knowing that the OECD was one of the kind of forerunners in kind of defining guidelines for multinational companies, and now with the ongoing debate also at the European level about kind of putting in place obligatory due diligence requirements for companies that work on the European market. Carrie, how does kind of the movement towards a well-being economy, how is that linked to clearer regulation and due diligence obligations for companies? How do you make that link in the OECD?
So I think one thing to highlight is that there are many businesses and companies trying to get ahead of the game on this, and they are already talking to us about how they can use our wellbeing framework to guide their strategic decisions. So the again, I don't want to be naive about this concept of win-win, and I've looked at some of the comments in the chat. You know, we have to be very pragmatic, but I think there is an incentive for business to be aligned with what the government wants to achieve, because down the track, what the government wants to achieve may result in regulation, for example. So there is an advantage to business in getting ahead of the game. I think, you know, there is a broader conversation about the purpose of business and how you measure the success of business. And again, there are types of organizations who are seeking to redefine those terms. But again, at the moment, that is a particular group of businesses and not all of businesses. So government set the broad regulatory framework that applies to everybody. So I think there's push and pull here. There's about making it attractive for businesses to move in this direction through the series of incentives that you provide, but also, again, what Catherine was saying, making it clear what's possible. You know, drawing out the good practice examples, showing people how it can be done. That's a core part of moving people along in the conversation. So I think highlighting areas of positive activity in this space, of which we are seeing more and more, is an essential part of it.
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, I'll also ask Catherine about this question and some related questions. So indeed, there was the question from Louis, which he put in the chat quite at the beginning of the discussion, where he said, well, I question that there are win-win solutions, and maybe those who are involved in negotiations, you know, they probably benefit, but not necessarily the others. And what about the inequalities? And there's another question in the chat from Susana Pescada, who's also saying, well, who's influencing the policies and kind of the bigger impact that business stakeholders have. So Catherine, how can we make sure that well-being policies are kind of defined from the perspective of really tackling the existing inequalities and overcoming these with policies that are focused on well-being?
Thank you, and thanks for all three of those questions. And I think what unites them is really the issue of power and who has access and influence into the policy making process. And I think one of the frustrations that we see borne out in terms of certain political reactions and populist uprisings, perhaps, in the last few years is a frustration that everyday people don't feel that they're represented and their voices and interests are being heard in the corridors of government sufficiently over the last few years. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. Not least the way so often those who have financial wealth are able to influence government much more. I mean, you can only have to look at the lobbying statistics and regulation and flows of financial money in Europe, in Washington, in London, and so on, to see the disproportionate nature and people feeling that the only chance they have is maybe voting once every few years. And there's so many examples of that just seed an incredible frustration of people. And I think so often it's really well-founded. The challenge is, though, that to me, there's two terms that I find really frustrating, two words. One is growth, because as you've heard at our conversation this morning, it's so much more nuanced and complicated. There's not some false binary between all growth is bad or all growth is good. I mean, if you take away any message from Carrie and Gary and I, that is the message to take away, that it's a qualitative question around growth. But the term business is way too blunt to capture the diversity of business behaviors. And I think in the last 12 months, that is just accentuated. We have seen, quite frankly, the good, the bad, and the ugly of business behaviors. We've seen profiteering, absolutely, in the most disgusting, horrendous way. But we've also seen some extraordinary efforts from the business community, whether that's large companies or whether that's small local shops, just making sure they're open, delivering to vulnerable customers who are shielding, making sure they're paying their suppliers on time. We see some supermarkets here in the UK have said, we're going to pay our suppliers much, much earlier. We have seen a lot of examples where businesses are often putting aside the profit imperative to be part of a collective effort. And beyond COVID, we see that as well. There's a whole lot of business leaders who are really putting their shoulder to the wheel and thinking about how can enterprise contribute to these goals of collective well-being. That said, that effort is so often undermined by different businesses leveraging and lobbying in the corridors of power to reduce regulation and to reduce standards and so on. And so it's a really messy, complicated picture. But I think Lewis's and Susanna's points around who is it who decides really points to one of the key aspects of the wellbeing economy agenda, and that's around the nature of our democracy. And I think we're seeing really nice democratic innovations springing up across the world, whether it's participatory budgeting exercises, citizens' assemblies exercises, citizens' juries, mini publics, a whole lot of different exercises. And if you read across some of the outcomes of some of them, it's a beautiful reminder that this is the agenda that people really want. I mean, you only have to look at the recent findings of the UK Climate Assembly, where the general public, so a representative group of people who represent the UK public, are really going more boldly than the current policy regime. And so I think the outcomes of some of those exercises just show when people deliberate, where experts are on tap but not on top, when people have the circumstances and the facilitation to really listen to each other and hear from each other and reflect, then you get these very generous, magnanimous perspectives that go beyond where current political level is. And so I think it reinforces that there is the idea that the public aren't up for this is no excuse, because they are when they're given the chance to reflect. And it's also mirrored by a lot of opinion polls as well that have been coming out of the last few years of people, and particularly during COVID, but beforehand, people saying, here's what matters to me most. These sorts of opinion polls inform the SDGs, but we're seeing people saying after the pandemic, people want governments to prioritise health and well-being and position the economy as in service of those goals. Sorry, long answer, but really, really brilliant questions.
Thanks a lot, Catherine. Also great that you're referring to the question of, how that links to citizens' participation. And we are just at a moment where the EU is launching the ever largest citizens consultation in its history with the Conference on the Future of Europe, which is really about this big narrative and the kind of the future that we want to see in the EU and the kind of priorities that we want the European Union to set. So for all of those of you who are interested in this kind of debate about the big narrative, watch out for that process, and also kind of check out what your governments are doing as part of that process. It might be an interesting channel to also bring these messages to the agenda. So you've already made the link, Catherine, to the question of how that maybe disenchantment with the political institutions, how that links to recent success of populist governments. And there is a question in the chat from Pedro, who's saying, does the emergence of populist political movements relate to the inefficiency of the current socio-economic system to achieve good and equitable social and economic outcomes, and also the lack of space for meaningful public engagement and policymaking? What risks and opportunities may emerge from that? And I'd like to give that question to Gary. Also, if we turn around the question, does it make a government more popular? Does it instill trust in a government if it embarks on the well-being economy journey?
Okay, no, thanks very much. I think maybe I'll start with the trust in government, because I think that's a really important indicator of both citizens' trust, obviously, in the political leadership and the institutions. And it's something that's often picked up, and certainly in Carrie's measurement frameworks around the Better Life measurement. So trust in government is really important. And I think, in a sense, trust in government, if you think back to what I was talking about, the National Performance Framework, trust in government, the purpose of government, and how government operates with citizens. So if you put dignity, trust, integrity, that you're a society that respects the rule of law, then that creates the conditions for how government operates and how government interacts with citizens. And that's, I think, really important. We've had a number of different exercises over different time periods. I think if I think back to maybe 2013, 2014, we had a Fairer Scotland consultation, which went out into communities all over Scotland and really asked people what matters, what determines the quality of your life. And actually, it was much further away from what you might have envisaged we think we're doing within central government. I think, and so that really fed into what was important for people, where some of the things that Catherine talked around, the we all principles about connectedness, feeling part of society, inclusion, having adequate housing, friendship, that type of thing was really important. So that, in one sense, really informed our thinking. The other thing is obviously lived experience as well. It's actually how you reflect the actual experience of people that are dependent on your services and how that comes back in. And Catherine's done some work involved in that in Scotland for people within our looked after care system as well. So I think there's different kind of ways and mechanisms to do that. And I think your question around populist governments or different governments will reflect the changing mood of time. I think trust in government, if you're trying to do change, is really important indicator. Open government is important as well, and actually whether people have a sense of control, whether a sense of input into the system. We've tried a number of different things in Scotland. Engagement with the business community. We have a business pledge where we ask businesses to, a kind of peer-to-peer pledge, commit to how they operate in terms of sustainability, how they treat their staff, commit to paying the living wage and how they interact. And we've tried to kind of change the culture of business so that that's seen as a positive thing. Often with business, they take the norms from the sector. So if it's normal in the sector to compete on wages or price or resources, then that is reinforced and that continues. So some of this is about changing cultural norms as well across sectors. So I think that's an example on the business side. I think there's a wider role as well for one of the criticisms you could say about the performance frameworks, and when you go out and talk to people, is technocrats like the performance frameworks because we can work around that, we can drive outcomes, but actually people out in the street maybe don't know about the national performance framework. So some of these systems for organising government are really important within government. Actually, when you talk to people outside, it's much more basic. And I think having that understanding is really, really important. And then trying to create a common purpose so one of the challenges in a system, particularly within government, is that departments are often structured in departments, and departments will have particular goals. And part of the performance frameworks and systems and common government is to recognise that just as education, health and economy are all interlinked, and with the environment, and we can't achieve it unless we do that. But that's a reprogramming of government a lot. And actually some governments are set up that the cabinet secretary or the minister has a specific objective for that. So there's something about changing how government operates as well. And I think Carrie talked about the kind of policy pathways moving from frameworks, but it's really difficult because you get into trade-offs, you get into short-term, medium-term, longer-term, and you get into this this type of kind of system of change and how you balance the different priorities. So I've kind of went a long way around trying to answer your question, but I think if you start with where you want to get to, how you're going to do it, and recognise the interdependencies, then you will start making progress along that track.
Thanks, Gary. Let's go back to the initial question of around well-being indicators. I see two very interesting questions here, and maybe we can ask Carrie to answer these, given that you're our expert on well-being indicators, and maybe we can also try if our participants can speak themselves. So I would like to invite Tobias to ask his questions about the complexities around indicators, and also Susanna Fonseca, your first question around GDP as an indicator. Maybe you can ask both of these questions and we can see if Carrie wants to answer them. Can we enable Tobias to speak?
Yes, hello?
Yes, we can hear you, Tobias.
Yes, so I do not question like the notion of having all these different indicators as a policy goal in a sense, but my hunch is that ultimately it is, I mean, like compared to GDP, it's a very, if not impossible task to actually reduce them to, even if it's like a set of numbers. So especially like to impose, I suspect that like if you want to impose like top-down policies, it may not be so easy, because yeah, I think the examples I gave in terms of health and education, what constitutes a good education for some child may be very different from another, and health also has, the notion of what is good health may also differ between different individuals. So yeah, I think my hunch is that there's like a totally different paradigm that you really need to enter, which is more normative possibly, and yeah, so if you have any thoughts about this, it would be interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Tobias, for that question about how can we kind of fit reality into a set of indicators. I'm sure Carrie has some thoughts on that. Maybe Susanna, you want to add to your question, which is also on indicators and more specifically GDP and a kind of changing GDP. Do you want to ask your first question as well?
Yes, thank you. Good morning. Yes, because from presentations I understood that some of the panelists consider that GDP will remain as an important indicator to evaluate the society. So, but it gives a very narrow perspective of, even as an economic indicator, it only includes certain aspects of economy. It doesn't include the future aspect, it doesn't include the well-being aspect. So there's, is there a possibility, do you see it, or is it too offensive, the idea of including new aspects in GDP? Adding new layers of information that countries have to include, because that might be also a way, instead of saying bad things about GDP, it's changing the indicator itself in its nature. Thank you.
Shall I have a first go, and then Catherine, I saw that you want to come in as well. So creating a dashboard is obviously a reductive exercise. The richness and complexity of life condensed into 80 indicators is a difficult task. I recognize that, and I really acknowledge the question because it's a really important one. I think a couple of points here. We've been developing our dashboard for over 10 years now, and some of the things that we really try and focus on in our dashboard is leading indicators. So indicators that are really signals for the whole system moving in a certain direction. So, we're looking for indicators that capture a lot of the variance that we're interested to say it in technical terms. In non-technical terms, it means having an indicator that moves in the same direction as all the other things you care about, that can kind of be taken as a beacon. And actually, one of our criteria for adding indicators in a dimension is if they don't correlate strongly with our headline. Because if they don't correlate strongly, that means they're capturing aspects of life that go beyond that beacon, that headline signal indicator. So we have a system for selecting our indicators to make sure that they've got a lot of explanatory power. They actually capture well the dimension we're interested in. And we have a diversity of indicators in each dimension. So for education and health, we have a diversity of indicators, each of which are adding unique information to the pattern. The other thing I'd say in this space is that we are very much focused on outcomes. So we're not looking at the inputs, we're not looking at government spending, we're not looking at the outputs, we're not looking at the number of teachers per pupil. We're really looking at the end result. What is the quality of the knowledge and skills that people have at the end of the process? So that really helps us narrow down some of the indicator set. And actually, to be honest, when it comes down to it, you're left with a very small number of indicators that can do all of those jobs internationally. On the point about GDP, should we expand it, make it better? I think several of the speakers have already pointed out the limitations of GDP. It can't tell you about the sustainability even of growth over time, the sustainability of the economy over time, let alone the sustainability of the planet. It doesn't tell you anything about distribution. So you could be growing, but it doesn't tell you where the growth goes. And it fails to capture a variety of non-market goods, so things that aren't exchanged and traded on markets, that people really value, like the value of their social connections, like the value of good health. So we've kind of covered that ground. Can you add all of that into GDP? Well, so one important thing to say is that the national accounts are actually far more interesting than just the GDP statistics. So there is a lot of interesting stuff in the national accounts that you could bring forward that would involve a more informed conversation in policy. So the focus on GDP itself is narrow, the national accounts are wider, but there's still a variety of things that are not covered in the national accounts. And here, I guess I'd go back to Catherine's analogy of a sticking plaster. Are we going to take something that was fundamentally designed for a different purpose and plug things in it, which would be, you know, adapting GDP, which was designed to measure economic activity, and then we try and add all of this non-economic activity in? Or do we just take a step back and say, what do we value as a society? What do we need from growth, and focus there? And I think there's a job on both ends. GDP and the national accounts are constantly evolving, and there's really good work to be done there to better capture what is going on in the economy, including satellite accounts on unpaid work and all sorts of other things, including valuing, for example, ecosystem services. There is activity underway to make sure that the national accounts framework can incorporate a really wide variety of things that matter to people, and that's really important work. But I think alongside that, we also need information about the outcomes that we're aiming for. I'll stop there. Catherine, go ahead.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Susanna and Tobias, for the questions. To focus firstly on Susanna's one, have a look at the work of the Genuine Progress Indicator, which does to a large extent try to take GDP and correct it in a way for the good and the bad. So it adds in good things like volunteering and access to local green space, and it takes out and accounts for inequality or commuting or defensive expenditures like buying bottled water. And a lot of the analysis of genuine progress vis-a-vis GDP per capita shows that since the late 70s in many countries around the world, that they have diverged, and genuine progress and under that measure has flatlined. So there's a really interesting story to be told there, and there are efforts going on to have GDP as a starting point and do the corrections that you allude to. But I think Carrie's phrase there of we need to bring forward some of these other indicators that are already present. And of course we could get better data and they could always become more timely. But I really think our colleagues in statistics offices in OECD countries largely have largely done their job. And the baton needs to be passed to policy entrepreneurs. You know, how do we make politicians accountable for these measures, because we do count biodiversity loss, and we count loneliness, and we count financial precariousness and various aspects of inequality and housing access and quality of housing. It's not as if statistics officers do not have some numbers around this. The question is political accountability. And I think that links back to Tobias's question around how do we make sure there's a general conversation that shines a spotlight on some of these questions. And there is so many beyond GDP initiatives out there, and most of them start as really well-intentioned activities to try and really focus and bring to the fore the sort of dimensions of quality of life that really matter. They inevitably then become rather technical translations of that. And Carrie's probably heard me remark that when most people are talking about dashboards and indicators, they're talking about their car, not their quality of life. And so how do they see themselves in these rather complicated frameworks, no matter how beautifully visually they are designed? Do they recognize their life there? And I think there's almost a feedback loop that those of us working on these issues need to try to develop. And to me, Carrie used the term beacon, which I love. I've been using the term cornerstone indicators, that we need to come up with, I don't know, half a dozen measures that we know correlate to those suite of aspects of multidimensional well-being. So really do correlate to what really matters. But they'd also have to pass a second hurdle, and that is that they make intuitive sense for everyday people. Because otherwise everyday people will not rally around them. They won't ask their politicians when they call in radio stations, or talk to them at political hustings, or think about them when they go to the ballot box. And so the example I give to illustrate this idea of cornerstone indicators is the number of girls who ride their bikes to school. Because if you think of that figure, you can know that so many really important things are in place, in practice. Parents can afford bicycles, they're providing breakfast for their kids, the streets are safe enough, schools are open, it's not locked down, it's not polluted, there are local services. They won't cover everything, but you could have a suite of them that perhaps does start to get in the right direction. But I bet you the person perhaps who made Gary's really nice looking coffee that he's drinking there would also resonate with the idea of the number of girls who ride their bikes to school being an important measure. And so imagine if we went into elections and had politicians saying, under my watch, this is what's going to change. You had, local government mayors saying that's how they're going to measure the success of the city. Because I do think it is possible to distill it down, but it has to be done with people as the heart of that conversation as well.
Thanks a lot, Catherine. There are two more questions in the chat that I'd like to kind of bring together and maybe direct towards Gary. There's one question from Pedro, who is saying, asking, is the degrowth movement contributing to the debate on the well-being economy? So for those of you who are not familiar with degrowth, it's a movement which was kind of first started mainly from academia, or let's say alternative economists, but which in the meantime has been seen a lot of uptake from civil society organizations and the environmental movement and others, arguing that overall we need to basically degrow our inflated economies in well, at least in the highly developed world. So Petra is asking, is it reasonable to aim for a post-growth economy? Well, what's the view of the panel on the decoupling argument, so decoupling growth and resource use? And I think there's a related question from Rafa from Ecologistas en Acción from Spain. Can you talk about the relationship between growth and climate change? Shouldn't we go towards a shrinking economy? What is your opinion on the proposal to reduce the working day? So I think that's all kind of in that framework of kind of a degrowth and post-growth economy. How does that relate to what you do in Scotland, Gary?
Okay, thanks very much. Two great questions, really interesting, and I'm sure both Catherine and Carrie will want to come in on them as well. If I can just say one thing, just in the follow-up to the last one about, first, just to say in the sense that we have a duty to report our performance across the 11 outcomes, and below each of those there's a set of indicators. So GDP would be one, but alongside that would be employment rate, how many are earning the living wage, household income, hours worked, underemployment. So you go much deeper to get a sense of actually what's happening to people on the ground. And I would just echo Carrie's point about the national accounts are really important to understanding the components of GDP, whether it's consumption, investment, trade, government spender. So that's probably another reason for that. So on the Pedro's question, is degrowth movement contributing to debate? Yes, of course it is. And I think the degrowth movement is part of that wider recognition of the need to change the economic system and how it relates both to social outcomes, the rising inequality that we've seen in advanced economies, particularly over the last 15 to 20 years, and obviously the environmental challenge that we face. I mean, Catherine's book's really good on the economics of arrival. I would give that a plug to say, explaining around how an economy adapts when you get to a certain level, and her notion of kind of diminishing returns from continued growth. There's also the work of Kate Raworth, I think, on the donut economics. And to me, that kind of framing around the kind of planetary boundaries, or in our context within government, your legal commitments to reduce climate emissions. So we have a 2045 target. We have really ambitious targets to reach by 2030. We report annually on our change, and we have to legally update our climate change action plan and present that to Parliament every 5 years. So that's kind of drivers within the system, but recognising that wider policy. I think, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at producing a new 10-year national economic plan for economic transformation in Scotland, which the new government that was just elected at the beginning of May have come back in. And there's a range of policies within that as well that reflect, I suppose, the potential to change how we live and work. So the 4-day week is one of those, a commitment to have a look and consider how that could operate. I think on the broader change about growth and climate change, and whether it's a decouple or a recoupling or whatever terminology you put, I think what's happened is that there's a recognition that obviously with the climate targets and biodiversity as well loss, that we can't continue as we have. And I think this is where measurement comes in. We also produce natural capital accounts now that have values for ecosystems. We've been tracking the stock of natural capital in Scotland through a natural capital index for about 25 years now. And actually you can start to see how the different capitals play into the system. So for me, in one sense, this is really about transformation of the systems, because you won't meet the 2030 or 2045 targets without that transformation. And I think in a sense we're at a point where the system will kind of flip, and it will flip quite quickly. And I think once you line up the incentives and markets, that change will happen. So I don't see growth and climate change as being a decoupling or rivals. I just see basically the economy now having to adapt and be part of a system that basically is compliant with net zero, can deal with biodiversity loss, and that'll have implications for how we live and work. And the final bit, if I can go back to GDP just for a minute, there's a lot of debate around adding in what GDP doesn't measure, and Carrie articulated that. And I suppose in a sense, the one thing that GDP has too much focus or prevalence on is that it's used as a denominator in other measures. So when they compare countries' public finances or their tax revenue or their overall wealth, GDP is the measure. So we need to get some broader measure that actually says, okay, and I think that's what the OECD are really trying to do, to kind of try and bring that broader awareness of measures. But whilst it remains as a as a flagship indicator for that might drive investment in the economy, or might drive people's perceptions, or how the cost of borrowing in countries, then that remains a challenge, I think. But let me stop there.
Thanks a lot, Gary. There's also one additional comment in the chat that you may want to read from Elisabeth, which is quite kind of linked to the question of degrowth and kind of the question of how the well-being economy relates to refocusing on a more on kind of relocalizing our economies and reconsidering kind of the ever-increasing globalization of trade patterns, even where they increase our kind of social environmental impact. So thanks for that comment, Elisabeth. There's one new question which I'd like to take from Islene. She's asking, how what we've been talking about here, now we're obviously focusing on a quite European context. We're talking about a kind of developed countries context. But she's wondering, how does what we say here relate to the question of or the challenges in developing countries? What does the well-being economy concept have to? What does it offer to developing countries? And are we she's asking, is there a risk that we are letting those countries behind because they perform slower? Is the question. Maybe Catherine, do you want to answer to that? What does the well-being economy concept offer to developing countries?
Sure, and is it all right to just also reflect on the decoupling question?
Of course, sure, go ahead.
I think it's really, really good point, and the analysis of folks behind the degrowth agenda, I think, is extraordinarily sound. I'll just personally admit that I'm not convinced that the term, and particularly how it's used unapologetically by proponents as a missile term, is something that's going to build the sort of collaboration and partnerships and coalitions that are needed for the monumental change that's required. So I'm massively sympathetic to the analysis behind it, but something that's slightly more positive and inclusive, hence partly why the term well-being economy is something I think is getting a lot of traction. It's more forward-looking and more positive, is useful. My concern around the decoupling question, well, one is that there is so much evidence that if it's happening in relative terms for some measures, it's not happening in other measures, and it's not happening fast enough or in absolute measures. It's also, though, even if theoretically we could completely decouple growth from environmental impact, which I guess to some degree, even though you need material for services and so on, theoretically that may be to some degree possible, even if it's not enough. But that's just focusing on the environmental side of the economic challenges. And I think we've talked a lot already this morning about how if just to fix the environmental side is not enough, because the social justice questions are so profound. So even if we could decouple the economy to the extent necessary without attending to questions of rent extraction and precarious work and treatment of workers and questions of democracy that we've discussed, we still won't have sorted things out. We won't have created a well-being economy. So the question we need to focus on is all these issues matter, and we need to attend to them in an interlinked way rather than just break them down into narrow, isolated pockets. The question on developing countries is really well made, and it's in a way the well-being economy agenda learns so much and is inspired so much by wisdom that comes from across the world. There is no GDP per capita based monopoly on ideas and wisdom and intelligence for how we should operate our economies, and there's lots of thinking and movements that come from the countries that are not the rich industrialized global north that I think needs to inform how we think about restructuring the economies, not least but not ending with First Nations wisdom around taking care of the land and cherishing land and understanding the seventh generation principle. I do think, though, we should hold our hands up and recognize that it is the rich industrialized countries that are taking more than their fair share of ecological room and have done for centuries. And that's the legacy of that, I think, puts the onus of change in countries like the OECD countries most urgently. having said that, there's questions around, I think I said earlier that you'd have to learn from others' mistakes because you don't have enough time to make them yourself. The idea of those countries following the same development pathway that those countries, that the rich countries of GDP rich countries have been through would be profoundly problematic, given all we know about the collateral damage to people and planet of that journey. And so we have to have a conversation about leapfrogging, which is often used in the sort of carbon infrastructure sense of the word, but maybe we also need to think about cutting to the chase in terms of designing tax systems differently, designing enterprises differently, so that, you know, creating the wellbeing economy much earlier and not seeing this as just a follower conversation and going through the same journey, because they can do better than go on the journey that the rich industrialized global north has been on, given all the damage that it's done. But ultimately, I think there is just so much we need to learn from countries around the world, and not think that there's any monopoly of wisdom or ideas.
Thanks so much, Catherine, for the answer. My colleague, Kati Wiese, has just shared a link in the chat for a report that we've published, I think last year, about that kind of problematic concept of decoupling and how it relates to our discussion. So in case you're interested, do consult that report. And actually, as we've mentioned at the beginning, today's debate is also part of a larger project we're involved in called Climate of Change. And in the context of that project, the EEB, together with Oxfam, we've published a report about towards a well-being economy that serves people and planet. So I'd like to invite my colleague Kati, who's one of the two co-authors of the report, to also share some of our recommendations from that report, and kind of relate to some of the things that we've heard in the discussion. Kati, can we enable you to speak?
Yes, can you hear me actually?
Yes, we can.
Perfect.
Yes, go ahead.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. Yeah, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present also some of our recommendations. As Patricia said, I'm Kati Wiese, and I'm working for the European Environmental Bureau on economic transition policies. And we are, of course, very happy about the discussion today, as we've been working on policies, how to transition towards a well-being economy. Also, we also say post-growth economy for quite a while now. And yeah, as Patricia just mentioned, just around like 2 months ago, we published a report together with Oxfam, how we could do that. And that's also been mentioned today before, but one of the core recommendations is that we have to reframe our core policy goals towards well-being, and that we also need to apply this to the key European frameworks, such as the European Green Deal, the governance framework, or also the Environmental Action Program. And with that comes then also the need to then introduce better methods of measuring the well-being of people within our planetary boundaries. And as we already heard today, I mean, there are already a lot of different methods out there. So it's really, as Catherine said, about starting to using these different indicators and to test them on a larger scale, and also to have the political support for it. And on the other side, we also acknowledge in the report that the misguided aim of GDP growth persists, not only because decision makers and larger parts of the public are unable to imagine an alternative. It's also because our economies, and also the European economy especially, is structurally dependent on continuous GDP growth. So, for example, when we look at employment and work, we kind of depict our economic system at the moment as an endless treadmill, how we say it. So the growth-driven market system, as we have it now, continues to work as long as we become more productive. But as gains in productivity lead then to the loss of formal jobs, if overall production is not expanded, expansion becomes necessary to avoid mass unemployment. And this doesn't have to be this way. So in our report, we outline different policy options, how we can break the structural dependence of, for example, work and GDP growth, such as a job guarantee scheme or reduced working hours. And I think that's also been mentioned before, that shortening the working week could, for example, help to stabilize our economic system, because it allows more people to gain employment, but it's also good for the worker themselves because it reduces stress and the risk of burnout and has significant or positive impacts on the environment. And actually, the Spanish government has agreed to test a 4-day working week. So, I mean, we also see progress in these regards. And I think it's very important that we also share these positive examples to learn from it. And another point that I just would like to mention here is that it's important also to introduce policies that enhance our economy to transition towards a carbon neutral, non-toxic and circular economy. And I mean, there are very different ways, or practical ways how we can do it. So one important aspect is just to enhance the lifespan of products through post-growth or well-being adapted product design. So that can involve the need or policies that enable the creation of products that have a longer lifespan, that are modular, for example, or locally produced. And another recommendation in that regard is that the need to shift from ownership to usership so that we enhance circular and sharing and solidarity economic practices. So we need to increase also the agency and the control of the consumer, so to say, to come from a consumer to a prosumer. And there are also already actually businesses that follow a more holistic approach. Maybe you all know Patagonia, the textile company, or also Mondragon Cooperative. So I think it's also important to, as I said before, to share and practice these examples. And we also highlight, and I think that's also been said by Carrie before, that there's not one fits all policy solution. So it will be a process of a gradual transformation, and it's important to test out how certain policy interventions affect our economy, and that there's no clear one defined roadmap to follow. Yeah, maybe I will leave it here. I will also share the report, so you have to find some more detailed recommendations there. And thanks again for letting me speak this shortly.
Thanks, Kati. We've already pasted the link to the report in the chat for everybody. So do consult it if you're interested. So, well, we're actually coming to the end of our exchange here. There's still kind of a range of really, really interesting questions and comments in the chat, which we can't all address, but I just wanted to mention kind of some things that people have mentioned here just for our kind of to take away, not to take away, but I mean, kind of to take away some questions with us, basically. So there's been an interesting question about how do we challenge kind of mainstream economics? How do we take this to university curricula? It's a very interesting question. There's an interesting question from Jose about how, our discussion about a well-being economy here, I mean, in this European context, relates to the fact that a lot of the, environmental threats are essentially global threats, and how does it relate to global level discussions around climate emergency and addressing biodiversity loss? I guess we could also have spent the whole morning discussing about the kind of global democratic framework and we need and how we need to develop global environmental governance. So that's a great question, and I'm sure that would be a very fruitful discussion to delve into. There's another question around how we can kind of engage citizens actively in that well-being economy. I think we've addressed to some degree, to a good degree, the role of business. Of course, we could have a whole other conversation around citizens' contribution to a well-being economy. There are questions around, how do we ensure that we don't risk how do we avoid the risk that we kind of get stuck in incremental fixes rather than really addressing the systemic problems. I think we've addressed some of these questions, but again, I think that could be another long conversation. There's some more comments from Tobias about the indicators and the how we need to localize indicators to make them meaningful. And there's a last comment, which is also quite interesting, from Alexandre, who's saying that Portugal seems to have a particularly big challenge with biodiversity loss and a very high number of endangered species. So obviously, well-being for human beings is very closely linked to animal well-being. I think the one welfare approach is one thing that we've all discussed a lot this year in the pandemic. So thanks for raising our attention on that point as well, Alexandre. And well, I would like to thank all the speakers. I mean, this has been an excellent debate. When I saw the kind of amount of time that we had allocated for this, I was a bit afraid it would be very long, but I have to say it's been very, very interesting. And I don't think anyone was bored here. I also see that the number of participants hasn't dropped at all, despite the quite lengthy discussion here. So I think that means that all the three of you, I mean, you've been so engaging and it's been so interesting and so clear. So thanks so much, Carrie, Catherine, and Gary for, committing that morning to the discussion. Thanks so much for your contributions. It's been so interesting. I hope that this discussion is triggering a bigger debate about a well-being economy in Portugal, given that we have a lot of participants from Portugal, from civil society, from institutions, from government, interested citizens. So I hope you're taking this debate you're taking something away from the debate, and you will multiply the message and discuss it at home and with your colleagues and in your work environment. With that, I'd like to hand over back to Francisco, who's going to do a summary and some closing remarks of this morning's event. Francisco, over to you.
Muito obrigado, Patrícia. Obrigado pela excelente moderação. Obrigado também à Carrie, à Catherine e ao Gary. Apenas algumas considerações finais daquilo que nós achamos que foram aspectos muito importantes. Uma das questões tem a ver precisamente com esta ideia dos indicadores e das médias, em que, se calhar, mais do que as médias, a questão das desigualdades, o enfoque, no fundo, naquilo que é misturar o objetivo com o subjetivo, o presente e o futuro, são, sem dúvida, dimensões que temos de considerar para esta economia de bem-estar. Temos aqui novos termos, novos conceitos, dignidade, a forma de deliberação, ouvir as populações, uma participação efetiva e um aspecto que me pareceu crucial, que é realmente integrar esta componente nos orçamentos do Estado, de forma a realmente se repercutir aquilo que nós queremos no curto e no longo prazo. Depois também encararmos aqui a questão de que o bem-estar não é igual para todas as sociedades e, portanto, nós temos que identificar os diferentes valores e o que nos deve guiar em termos de políticas públicas. A questão das assembleias de cidadãos, dos orçamentos participativos e um olhar mais sofisticado sobre o PIB, ou seja, no fundo, esta ideia de caminharmos para uma economia justa, mantendo o planeta saudável. Aliás, eu gostei bastante de umas das expressões que foram utilizadas, esta ideia de reconciliar o PIB e o bem-estar, que não devem ser colocados em direções opostas, mas devem ser precisamente enquadrados em conjunto. E depois o exemplo de termos já vários governos nesta linha de trabalho conjunto, onde podemos aprender com as boas práticas e com o que pode e deve ser um caminho de desafio que achamos que Portugal deve também, sem dúvida, encarar nos próximos tempos. Nós sentimos que foi um debate muito participado e gostaria aqui também de agradecer a todos aqueles que se envolveram. Obrigado também a todos os participantes e, sem menor relevância, agradecer também o enorme esforço dos intérpretes Isabel Berkmeier e Luís Pinto. Estamos certos de que mais eventos desta natureza serão proximamente promovidos sobre esta e outras temáticas pela Zero e despedimos-nos até uma próxima oportunidade, com votos de que estejamos mais ricos e preparados para desenvolver aquilo que é uma nova economia de bem-estar. Obrigado e um bom dia a todos.